Ever scroll through your feed and suddenly everyone is talking about the same thing?
Yeah.
A product or a movement or a political figure, and you think like, wow, where did that come from?
Right.
Like it just kind of came out of nowhere.
Well, our deep dive today is going to unpack just how those massive shifts in attention happen. We're looking at Revenge of the Tipping Point, a book that argues these explosions of influence, they're not as accidental as we might think.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is this book really takes this concept we think we all understand, the tipping point, and shows how in the digital age, it's almost been weaponized.
Okay.
It's not really about those organic word-of-mouth trends anymore. It's a lot more about deliberate engineering.
So it's not enough to have a good idea anymore.
Right.
You need someone to, engineer its popularity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finding myself a bit skeptical, to be honest.
Well, and that skepticism is healthy. The book certainly makes a bold claim.
Yeah.
It suggests we've moved from, what we used to think of as influencers to what it calls super spreaders.
Individuals or entities who exploit the very structure of the internet to shape our perception.
Super spreaders. That sounds ominous.
It does.
Are we talking about like some shadowy cabal that's controlling what we see online?
Not necessarily a cabal.
Yeah.
But the book does dive into how individuals, organizations, even governments can act as these super spreaders. They don't just have a platform. They understand how to make ideas go viral.
Okay.
Often by tapping into the psychology of sharing.
Okay, so instead of just putting out like good content, they're playing the system.
Mm-hmm.
Give me an example of what that looks like.
Think about, those political ads that seem eerily tailored to your fears or aspirations.
Oh, yeah.
The book argues that campaigns now use data, not just to target demographics, but to analyze the specific types of messages that trigger emotional responses. Fear, anger, hope, things like that.
So they figure out what pushes our buttons and then just hammer away at it.
Right.
Isn't that, kind of manipulative?
The book doesn't shy away from the ethical questions. It argues that this kind of manipulation is built on exploiting our existing biases. We're drawn to information that confirms what we already believe, and these super spreaders capitalize on that.
So how do they connect these targeted messages to like the bigger conversations happening in society? I'm thinking about movements like #MeToo that seem to capture a shared sentiment so well.
Right, and that's where the idea of what the book calls overstories comes in.
Okay.
These are the grand narratives that frame our understanding of the world. Think of them as like the underlying operating systems, the lenses through which we interpret events. So #MeToo, for example, tapped into existing overstories about power dynamics and systemic inequality.
So a super spreader might attach their message to an already resonant overstory, making it seem like part of a larger, important conversation.
Precisely. And by doing so, they make their message feel less like an isolated incident and more like part of a shared experience, amplifying its reach and impact.
Hold on, though. If these overstories are so powerful, can't they be used for good, too? Like driving positive social change?
Absolutely. And that's a key question the book explores. While it focuses on the potential for manipulation, it acknowledges that these same techniques can be used to raise awareness about critical issues,
Yeah.
mobilize people for positive change, even challenge harmful overstories.
This is where I'm starting to see the, revenge part of the tipping point, right?
Yeah.
It can be a tool for good or bad, depending on who's wielding it and for what purpose.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is that the book argues we've entered an era where understanding these dynamics is crucial for navigating the digital landscape.
Okay.
We can't just be passive consumers of information anymore. We have to become more discerning, more critical of the narratives we're being fed.
So it's not just about spotting fake news anymore. It's about understanding how information is being, packaged and framed and spread to influence our thinking.
Exactly. And recognizing the role of these super spreaders is key. They might be individuals, organizations, even algorithms themselves, but they all exploit the same principles of social influence to shape public opinion.
Okay, I'm starting to see the depth here. It's not just about whether a message is true or false. It's about understanding the forces shaping what we see and believe in the first place. This is going to require some serious unpacking.
And that unpacking is exactly what we're going to do. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll look at specific examples of how super spreaders operate in politics, media, and even social justice movements, revealing the tactics they use and the impact they have on our world. Let's start with a real-world example.
Okay.
That illustrates this idea of engineered tipping points.
Okay.
Remember the ice bucket challenge?
Oh, yeah, of course.
It seemed like it just came out of nowhere. Suddenly, everyone was dumping ice water on their heads for ALS awareness.
Yeah, I remember that. My feed was full of those videos. Even celebrities were doing it.
Mhm.
And it felt like this genuine outpouring of support for a good cause.
And it was incredibly effective. I
Y-
mean, they raised millions of dollars for ALS research. But it also really highlights how a seemingly organic phenomenon can be carefully orchestrated.
Yeah,
The challenge wasn't just some random act of kindness. It was seeded and spread strategically,
right.
leveraging social networks and our inherent desire to belong.
So was there a super spreader, as the book calls them, behind the ice bucket challenge?
Precisely.
Someone who understood how to make it go viral.
And this is where the book's insights get really interesting. It argues that in today's media landscape, super spreaders don't even need to, control traditional outlets like newspapers or TV.
Right.
They can leverage the 24/7 news cycle by creating content that's designed to be shared.
So instead of pitching a story to a journalist, they're creating the story themselves,
Right.
knowing that it'll get picked up and amplified by the media's constant need for new content.
Exactly. Think about like those viral videos or social media posts that dominate the news cycle for a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
They often tap into our emotions, outrage, amusement, even fear, making them irresistible to share.
Yeah,
And that's not always an accident.
right.
It's often by design.
Okay, so we've got these super spreaders, kind of gaming the media.
Mm-hmm.
But how does that translate to actually changing people's minds? I mean, seeing a video is one thing, but shifting beliefs that's a whole other level.
That's where the manipulation of overstories comes in. Let's go back to politics.
Okay.
Remember the book talks about how campaigns use data to craft targeted messaging.
Yeah, we talked about that in the first part.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah.
they're figuring out what makes us tick, what anxieties or aspirations they can tap into.
Now imagine a political campaign that identifies, say, economic anxiety as a key concern for a specific demographic.
Okay.
They don't just put out ads about the economy, they weave their message into an existing overstory about, say, the decline of the American dream.
So instead of just promising, economic policies, they're tapping into a deeply held belief that resonates with that group's fears and anxieties.
Precisely. And by framing their message within that overstory, they make it much more persuasive, much more emotionally resonant. It's no longer just about policy. It's about restoring something that's been lost.
That's pretty powerful stuff. It's making me think about, those social media movements that seem to, galvanize people so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Is the book saying they're all being manipulated?
Not necessarily. Remember, the book acknowledges that these techniques can be used for good as well as bad. Take the hashtag #MeToo movement again.
Yeah.
That was a movement that successfully leveraged the power of overstories to create a tipping point for social change.
But how do we distinguish between, genuine movements and those that are, more engineered?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to spot the manipulation?
That's a crucial question, and the book does offer some clues. One thing to look for is what's called astroturfing.
Astroturfing. I've heard that term before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
It's essentially the practice of creating a false impression of grassroots support. So imagine a movement that appears to have, thousands of passionate followers online, but in reality, a lot of those accounts are bots or paid trolls.
So it's like creating the illusion of this groundswell of support to make the movement seem more legitimate, more influential.
Exactly. And this is where the ethics of social engineering get really murky. A movement with genuine grassroots support might use some of these techniques to amplify its message.
Right.
But there's a big difference between amplifying an existing sentiment and manufacturing it entirely.
Okay, so we need to be wary of astroturfing.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the super spreaders who are just really good at what they do?
Mhm.
Like the influencers who can make a product go viral overnight. Are they manipulating us?
Mm.
Or are they just savvy marketers?
The book suggests that the line between marketing and manipulation is becoming increasingly blurred.
So how do we navigate this new landscape where we're constantly being bombarded with messages that are designed to influence our thinking and our behavior?
Well, the book argues that becoming aware of these tactics is the first step. We need to understand how superspreaders operate, how they exploit our biases and leverage overstories to shape our perceptions.
That's a lot to take in. It feels like we're all playing catch up in this new world of engineered tipping points.
It can be overwhelming,
Yeah.
but knowledge is power. The more we understand about these dynamics, the less susceptible we become to manipulation. And who knows, we might even be able to leverage these insights to drive positive change in our own lives and communities.
Okay, so we've talked about politics and media. We even touched on, social justice movements.
hmm
What other areas of our lives are being impacted by these, like, engineered tipping points?
Well, the book argues that one of the most pervasive and perhaps underappreciated areas is consumer behavior. Right. The rise of influencer marketing is like a prime example of how super spreaders are shaping what we buy, what we eat, what we wear, even how we spend our leisure time.
So those, like, unboxing videos and sponsored posts, those aren't just harmless entertainment. They're actually shaping our desires and our spending habits.
The book dives into the psychology behind this, arguing that our brains are wired to respond to, like, social cues.
hmm
So when we see someone we admire or identify with using a certain product, it triggers a desire in us to have that product too.
So it's not just about the, like, product itself. It's about the social signaling and the sense of belonging or status that comes with owning it.
And super spreaders in, the consumer space understand this implicitly. They very carefully curate their online personas.
Right.
They cultivate large followings and partner with brands to create content that feels authentic and aspirational.
It's like they're creating a lifestyle that we're all, like, subtly being encouraged to buy into.
Mhm.
But is this always a bad thing? I mean, some of these influencers do promote good causes or products that, genuinely improve people's lives.
That's true. And the book doesn't, paint all influencers with the same brush.
Right?
It acknowledges that there's a spectrum of ethical behavior, from those who prioritize transparency and authenticity to those who engage in, more deceptive practices.
So how do we tell the difference?
hmm
How do we as consumers become more discerning about who we trust and what we buy into?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve deeper into the strategies these consumer-focused super spreaders use
Okay.
and discuss some ways to become, more critical consumers in this age of engineered influence.
Okay, so we've covered how these super spreaders, as the book calls them, are operating in politics and media and even, how they're shaping what we buy. But it feels like there's, like, a missing piece here. If these tipping points are being engineered, are we all just puppets?
That's where the revenge aspect gets really interesting. The book argues that awareness is the first step to kind of reclaiming agency.
Okay.
It's not about rejecting all influence, but becoming more conscious of how we're being influenced.
So instead of, like, just scrolling passively, we need to be asking ourselves, why am I seeing this?
Mhm.
Who benefits from me sharing this?
Right.
What overstory is this tapping into?
Exactly. And that critical lens is especially important in, the realm of consumer behavior, where the lines between genuine enthusiasm and engineered desire can be incredibly blurry.
It's funny. Just the other day, I saw this ad for a new fitness gadget.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't even something I'd normally consider, but the influencer in the ad was just so convincing.
Yeah.
I almost clicked buy.
That's like a perfect example of how these super spreaders leverage our desire for, belonging and status.
Mm-hmm.
They create this narrative that associates their product with a desirable lifestyle or identity.
So it's not just about, the product's features. It's about the image it projects,
Mhm.
the tribe it kind of connects you to.
Precisely. And social media platforms really amplify this by showing us content that aligns with our existing interests and desires.
Right.
It creates like this feedback loop that can be really hard to escape.
So what can we do? How do we break out of this cycle and become, more conscious consumers? Does the book offer any practical advice?
One strategy the book highlights is diversifying your information diet.
Okay.
Instead of just following influencers or brands, seek out independent reviews, critical analyses, perspectives that challenge the dominant narratives.
So it's about, like, actively seeking out alternative viewpoints,
Mm-hmm.
not just letting the algorithm kind of curate our reality.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing the power of our own attention.
Okay.
Every click, every share, every purchase we make sends a signal to the algorithm,
Mhm.
shaping the content we see and the products we're offered.
So we're not just passive consumers. We're active participants in shaping this landscape of influence. That's both, like, empowering and a little terrifying.
It is. It's a reminder that we have a responsibility to be mindful of how we engage with information and consume products.
Yeah.
Our choices have consequences, not just for ourselves, but for the collective narrative we're all creating.
Okay, so we've talked about how to be more like discerning consumers.
Mhm.
But what about the bigger picture? If these tipping points are being engineered, can we actually use that knowledge to create positive change?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And while the book doesn't offer a simple answer, it does suggest that understanding, like, the mechanics of social engineering can empower us to participate more effectively in shaping the world we want to see.
So instead of just being swept along by the tide, we can learn to like ride the waves, maybe even steer the ship in a more positive direction.
The key is to be intentional, to align our actions with our values, and to support individuals and organizations that are using these techniques for good.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface of this topic. Revenge of the Tipping Point has really challenged me to think differently about how influence works in the digital age.
The book certainly raises more questions than it answers, but that's kind of the hallmark of a truly thought-provoking work. It's up to each of us to grapple with these ideas, to have those critical conversations, and to find ways to navigate this, complex landscape with intention and awareness.
And on that note, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to ponder. If information is power, and that power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of those who understand how to engineer tipping points, what role did W.E. Waite play in shaping the future of influence? That's something to chew on. Until next time, keep diving deep.